We are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short, and this is ACAM Learn.
Welcome to Inside the Teen Brain. This ACAM series will leave you inspired by best practice and armed with tips to transform your work. I'm Dr. Jane Gilmore and I have a special interest in the teenage brain. From puberty to about the age of 25, the brain is in a unique state, with core drives including identity, novelty, risk, peers, respect, autonomy and intense emotions. In each episode, we explore one of these developmental drives and answer three big questions. What's the background? So what? And now what? Today we examine negative risk. This episode is called A Second Chance. Now, our first big question. What does the literature tell us? Take a chance and the outcome could be good or bad. This episode explores harmful risk and young people who need a second chance to reset their life path. The benefits of risk are described in another episode. Strong data show many aspects of positive and negative risk-taking increase during adolescence and the early 20s, but notably antisocial risk peaks in the late teens. When it comes to risk-taking and the teenage brain, context is everything. In calm settings, Rayna and Farley's review argues convincingly that even younger adolescents can make informed judgments about risk. However, make the setting emotional or add peer presence to the mix and it's a very different game. Gardner shows teenagers are more likely than any other demographic to take dangerous risks, but only in emotional contexts. The executive functions, inhibition, control, and goal direction are fairly well developed by the mid-teens. Even so, Galvin's work suggests that the executive function's voice of reason can be drowned out by reward and sensation seeking because the brain's emotional centres are acutely sensitive in adolescence. Dual systems theories proposed by Casey Steinberg and others hypothesize different developmental trajectories for emotional and reasoning networks. And though aspects of these frameworks are contested, they do offer a credible explanation for adolescent risk-taking patterns, including criminality. For example, CBT interventions showing improved emotional regulation predict a reduction in criminal risk-taking. But other approaches might leverage the powerful biological drives of the teenage brain more effectively, like programs offering sports qualifications to young people in the criminal justice system. Remember, the propensity to take good or bad risk likely exists in the same person. It's family, peer, and societal experience that influences the direction of risk. So interventions offering an adaptive risk that feed the need for risk-taking, that provide an alternative identity, mentorship, and a positive peer group might just offer our young people the best odds on their second chance. We turn now to our second big question and ask, so what? For young people who take harmful risks, what can we do to help them change path? Well, to consider the implications for practice, I'm so pleased to introduce Professor Rosie Meek, a chartered psychologist with expertise in criminal justice and prisoner rehabilitation. She's authored numerous academic articles, chapters and books, and an influential review on behalf of the Ministry of Justice. Rosie is a Fulbright Scholar, UK Research and Innovation Policy Fellow and Advisor to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. So who better to steer our conversation today? Welcome, Rosie. It's lovely to have you on our series.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, I've got a very long list of questions and I'm sure we won't get through them all, so we better crack on. And I'll start with my first, which is really, I want to know a little bit about A Sporting Chance, the prisoner rehabilitation programme that you're involved in. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So I was invited by the then Justice Minister back in 2018 to undertake the work behind my Sporting Chance review on the back of having written a book and lots of articles and evaluation reports about the importance of sport and physical activity in our criminal justice system, particularly in our prisons. And so as part of that review, I explored what I thought were the key issues around sport, physical activity and movement in our justice system. And I came up with a set of a dozen or so recommendations about how we could better use sport and physical activity in our prisons, in our young offenders institutes, in our secure children's homes, in our pupil referral units and other parts of our justice system. And this was an exciting opportunity for an academic like me, because I had the opportunity to look at what was currently going on. And I should say at the very top of this conversation, there's some brilliant practitioners working in this space. Some people in the prison system, some partner sporting groups and bodies, lots of organizations who are really singing from the same song sheet on the importance of encouraging our young people to be physically active as part of efforts to rehabilitate and promote health and well-being. But I was also struck at how provision across our prisons and youth establishments was a little bit patchy. It relied sometimes on a really great member of staff going above and beyond. I didn't think the policy was there to create the robust enough framework. So that's where my recommendations came in. And I'm really pleased to say that despite obviously COVID coming in between that time and now, that the prison service, the youth custody service, and a whole range of practitioners have taken seriously those recommendations and have started to implement some of them in their work. The big backdrop, though, I'm seeing in our prisons is that, obviously, as you may have seen in the news, we have an overcrowding issue in our prisons, and we also have a staffing crisis. So it's very difficult to implement some of these positive initiatives against that backdrop. But for me, that's the reason I'm still pursuing this agenda. I still think there's a long way to go. And I see countless examples of sport and physical activity really helping turn around young people's lives. And it's still something where I'm frequently pleasantly surprised at the transformation that we can see.
So, I mean, which brings me to my second query, really, about the impact of the programme. I know it's a longitudinal data set, which, you know, of course, we all have data envy. That's such a wonderful opportunity. Do you have any sense of the impact that the programme is having in terms of rates of reoffending and so on?
Yeah, so I should say that that programme of work isn't the data in itself, but it draws on existing data and summarises existing research. So I was able, as part of that piece of work, to look at a whole range of evaluation projects that use sport and physical activity to engage with children, young people and adults. And in terms of the overall picture, there's some really promising findings around reducing reoffending, diverting people into education and employment, creating much better health and well-being outcomes. As you'll be not at all surprised to hear, I think there needs to be more research in this area around, exactly as you say, longitudinal studies, and also to be a bit more nuanced in what sort of outcomes we're looking at, because just a straightforward reoffending outcome is not always the most obvious one or helpful one to look at. I'm also very much involved in qualitative research, where I sit and talk to practitioners and people receiving these sorts of interventions to find out what it is behind the data that's having an impact on them. And that's where we get some of the really exciting, I think, qualitative findings that have been helping us shape provision, policy and practice in this area.
Could you give us a taster, you know, some highlights perhaps?
Absolutely. So I was in a youth prison just last week talking to young men who have been taking part in a training initiative where they are being coached to become football coaches. And these young men talk really passionately about how they found something which they really want to implement, not just whilst they're in prison, but after release from prison when they return to their communities. And I really get the sense, and this happens with so many of the programs I observe, that these initiatives had instilled a sense of hope amongst these young men. I work with young women as well, but the example I'm giving is some young men I was talking with. It gave them a sense of a different identity, which as you know, as a psychologist, is so critical when we're encouraging people to change behaviours. When people can start to see themselves in a different way, that can be one of the most powerful ways of bringing about behaviour change. So that's an example of just talking to some young men who were really into sport, which isn't surprising, but they were quite pleasantly surprised themselves about how they had, as a result of taking part in this initiative, started to see their own futures quite differently and been motivated to make some different choices. And obviously, when I'm talking to young people in prison, that's pretty important. We want people to start to think about their future beyond prison, and we want to put in place action plans, if you like, to support them in those new choices. I have an example of a young man who I met in prison during one of the park runs, which I was involved in establishing. And following a conversation with him, was able to give him some guidance and advice on how he could pick up his degree level studies, which he had been wanting to embark on before he received his custodial sentence. And I'm really pleased to say that he was successful then in returning to a university after he completed his prison sentence. And I got a wonderful letter from him after he graduated and was going into the workplace about how just that chance conversation at the end of a park run had given him that little bit of hope and the support that he needed to make that transition. So they're just a couple of examples that stay in my mind.
I mean, it's so interesting because as you're talking, I'm really struck by two themes there. One is the passion and the other one is the identity. And we know those are two key brain drives in young people under the age of 25. And so the program, you know, if you're thinking about the sport and movement program, it's harnessing a passion, in this case, sport, which is really interesting. And it's an opportunity to change identity from somebody perhaps who sees themselves as an offender, a difficult kid, a bad kid, as, you know, in transforming that into a sports person or so on. Can you hypothesize, and we've talked a little bit about the importance of that emotional idea and harnessing emotion, but can you talk a little bit about how you might hypothesize young people learn emotional regulation in that sport setting, in a sort of mechanism of change that might be going on?
Yeah, I mean, to illustrate that, I think we'll go back to one of the reasons why I started researching this topic, because as a forensic psychologist, I've worked in prisons for a very long time, and it struck me that the prison gym and the sports fields, if some prisons have them, are one of the few places in a prison where both the prisoners and the prison staff want to be, and a place where there's a certain amount of normalization. Where people actually talk about the fact they, for a brief period of time, they don't feel like they're in prison. It's quite liberating occupying these spaces. And I'm not being naive here. There are occasions when people don't feel safe, but actually it's remarkably unlikely, very few instances of violence in these spaces. And I think that's partly because people value occupying those spaces so much. There's that sense of normality, but critically, there are much more positive relationships between, when we're talking about youth prisons in particular, the young people who are being detained and the adults who are there in overseeing them. So the staff and those young people in their care. It's some of the most positive relationships I've seen in a prison setting. And that, of course, is incredibly valuable because the staff may be using that opportunity to demonstrate how best to regulate emotions and so on. But I also think there are some really valuable lessons in sporting opportunities where people can try out and practice ways of managing their emotions. And very early on, when I was looking at this, I evaluated some rugby-based programs in prisons. And we had some really powerful findings there about how particularly quite violent young offenders were managing their emotions better. We saw some amazing data around young people who had been in the segregation unit, who had been known as the troublemakers in the prison, who had repeatedly been involved in violent incidences, really transforming quite swiftly, surprisingly, as a result of taking part in this program. And when I sat and talked to these young men about those experiences, they explained how on the rugby pitch, they'd been firstly given a positive outlet for some of the frustrations they felt, the physical energy that they held within their bodies. But secondly, they were given an opportunity to try out ways of regulating their emotions. In a sport like rugby, discipline and respect and teamwork are all valued very highly. And people would very quickly be almost self-policed by their teammates if there was a violent outburst. And that was very powerful for me as a person evaluating the programme, that these young people had really absorbed and taken on those lessons on the pitch and translated them into their lives on the wings, for example, and reflecting on how they were better able to manage conflict and frustrations without resorting to violence. So for me, it seems to be a really, I don't want to say easy, but accessible way for some of the young people I work with to be able to find alternative ways of managing their frustration and their emotions, bearing in mind that some of these people have come from very complex backgrounds where they haven't had many opportunities to observe people managing their emotions and regulating those sorts of violent outbursts in a more positive way. Of course, what that brings is a great responsibility to our sports programs, because we also can probably all bring to mind examples of sports people who haven't behaved very well in those situations and have had violent outbursts. So it does show that how much some of our sporting figures in society almost have a responsibility to be demonstrating how to manage emotion in a pro-social positive way. It's to channel that into their sport.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really important point you make. But as you were speaking, I'm really struck with the idea about relationships. It's all about relationships, as it ever was. But the idea that, you know, in a different valued space, relationships can change. And those individuals that might not be seen as role models or somebody that can help you moderate or manage your emotions suddenly become that person because you are in a changed space. And thinking about how that could be applied to lots of different systems. You know, there's lots, you know, the challenges in terms of funding and staff retention could be applied very easily to the NHS. And so that you know, there's lots of challenges in different systems that are very similar. But the idea of taking these principles and ideas and testing them out in different systems, I think, is really interesting. And I think the important point about the role models that young people look to in terms of sports figures is an important one. It might be something to pause and reflect on. Absolutely. And in fact, that brings me to a question about the idea about mentoring. Now, we know that young people respond well to somebody who's slightly older, but who has relatable or lived experiences, as well as aspirational positions. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits and challenges of mentoring initiatives?
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is one of the areas of my research that predates actually my work in the role of sport and physical activity. So, if you like, I've always had an eye on the mentoring element of this context of my research because it is so powerful. And I look at mentors both within prison spaces as well as people with lived experience coming back into the justice system to mentor people who are still in the justice system, and that there's something very powerful about someone who has direct lived experience engaging with people who are going through a similar journey. It doesn't mean that we should be placing all responsibility on people with lived experience. I think we also need to be supporting mentors appropriately and giving them enough provision and support themselves and clinical supervision, if you like, because some of these mentors are carrying some pretty heavy stories as part of their day-to-day roles. But I think we can also be making better use of people with lived experience. And I was really compelled by the finding when I first looked at mentoring in prisons, that so many people who are in the justice system, when I asked them what they wanted to do when they came out of prison, said they wanted to support other people who'd been on their journey. You see that a lot in drug recovery also. And it's actually a very powerful, very generous statement to make. Many of the young people I've worked with in the justice system have been really let down by society in many different ways. And yet here I regularly have young people saying to me, I want to give something back to society, this kind of redemptive statement, which may come as some surprise to people who subscribe to this notion of othering people in the justice system as these kind of monsters who we're better off forgetting about. There's actually a lot of citizenship in these populations. So yeah, I think we do a pretty good job of harnessing the mentoring-mentee relationship. I do think we could do more to support mentors so that they are not being exploited and are fully supported in what they're doing. But for me, it's some of the most powerful transformative work we see when a mentor works with a mentee and time and time again, I've seen sport and physical activity be used as the vehicle there, as a way of developing a relationship, as a way of establishing some rapport and some trust. Because again, let's also remember that so many of the young people we have in the justice system have been let down by adults in their lives, including professionals. And we do need to be super cautious not to be replicating that notion that adults can't be trusted. So this is a big priority for me, is to support mentors so that they do have the capability and the emotional bandwidth to do as effective a job as they can. For that reason, I did some work with an organisation called UK Coaching recently, where we were looking at supporting coaches who are very established in their roles as sports coaches to come into prison spaces and to be supported so that they could do that with a full awareness and understanding of the emotional toil that some of that work takes, but also the rewards that it can bring in terms of supporting people. Very much borrowing from some of the youth work context around supporting young people.
But it's such a valuable leverage with some young people who might be on the edges of making a decision about which path to take. And I think we've talked actually in another episode about how young people can mentor in CAM services, you know, so that there's somebody there who's been through that experience, who's just one step ahead, but not too far ahead. And I think that's, you know, it's, as you say, it's something that could be explored with the appropriate support to a greater degree. I think that's a really important point.
I also think, just to add on to that, that the organisations I work with, I applaud because they have a commitment to employing people with lived experience. And again, I think we need to call out instances where that doesn't happen, and it could be happening, because those with lived experience who have been on that journey and who are suitably qualified and supported can do some incredible work in this space. And I think those organisations that I work with who really recognise that, and also recognise that it's not easy, they really reap the rewards in terms of the quality of the service that they offer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a powerful and important point. I mean, if we're thinking about the idea of mentoring, taking a step back, perhaps, you know, what can we learn or what can we do to support young people who aren't yet in the criminal justice system but might be heading that way? Have you got any thoughts on that?
I do, and historically there was more research on the role of sport and physical activity in this context, in the, if you like, the diversion away from the justice system. And historically, we have had some really good programs that have almost been triggered when someone's been on the periphery of the justice system. I'm thinking of some of the programs that the Youth Justice Board has supported, some of those diversion schemes where at-risk young people have been encouraged to take part in sporting initiatives. Of course, you and I both know there's such a risk period when people are excluded from school. I do think we could be doing more in that space, to be recognising that that's such a risk period, and so many of the children and young people I work with in prison, I think, could have been diverted away from the justice system if there'd just been a little bit more robust consultation around what that young person needed, and maybe some earlier intervention. I also appreciate there's some very challenging and complex young people in our justice system, and I do think those diversion programs work when they have the resource and the time and the capacity to engage on an individual level with a young person and to sit down and build a relationship. And again, it will come as no surprise to you that I suggest often sport and physical activity can be a great way of building up that relationship. Not always. The arts and music can be also very effective. But once that relationship is established and that trust is established, to think a bit more creatively about what that young person needs to divert them away from the justice system. And that might be finding an alternative passion or activity. Again, often sport is a really useful option there. I'm thinking about some of the boxing clubs that I work with in community settings, where I think they do some really powerful work in terms of engaging at-risk groups. It's seen as a non-threatening, inclusive community, very welcoming, and also a safe space for people to engage in. You know, so many people are very passionate about boxing and martial arts. And contrary to what some people think, that's not that we're teaching violent people to fight. It's that we're actually instilling a sense of community and discipline and respect. So for some of those sort of community-based organizations, I think they do incredible work, and they've suffered from terrible cuts to funding in recent years. And that's been very short-sighted, because if we can divert just one person away from entering the criminal justice system, we're making enormous both social and economic savings.
Absolutely. I mean, really struck again by the idea, you know, whether it's a prison culture, whether it's a school culture, the idea of moving or shifting it just a little bit adjacent to the system that might be associated with some difficult feelings, let's say, and that exploring whether it's sport or whether it's art or whether it doesn't, you know, whatever it is, it's not exactly at the center of the prison or the school, but it's adjacent, and that allows a different opportunity to develop relationships and explore these valuable skills. It's a really simple but incredibly powerful idea, just to move things out a bit.
It is. And just related to that, you just reminded me of one of my dreams, which I'm determined to see come into effect before
Dare to dream, Rosie. Dare to
dream big. But one of these dreams is relatively straightforward. I think that all young people who are in the justice system should be able to access some kind of sport fund where they can, it might be used to fund membership of a gym, or access to sporting kit, or travel so that they can get to train. You know, that might sound like a very kind of liberal, nice to have sort of opportunity. But again, I think this would be an incredible cost saver in the long term, because so many of the young people I work with would love to be kept busy and engaged, and they would like nothing more than to be training every night with people who they respect and admire. But they don't have necessarily that nice middle class family structure who's going to be able to ferry them around. And behind some of the work I did with a great organization called UK Active was this very notion that we should be opening up the physical activity spaces in our schools for people in the community to access. So yeah, sorry, I went on a tangent there, but that's I think one of the examples of where, if you think creatively and you ask young people what they want and need, we can come up with actually some quite cost-effective policy ideas.
Yeah, I think we just have to, open up our creative minds, and I think that's absolutely right. It's very interesting because it's not, the savings are, as you say, personal and economic. If we think about the cost to society. Okay, so we've been talking a bit about the way that there's always a way back when we mess up, and mistakes are often learning opportunities. So I wondered if you could be generous and share an experience that perhaps didn't work out the way you had expected, but perhaps it taught you something useful.
Oh, that's a great one. I think in academia, as you'll know, Jane, we're juggling a lot of different things. And I think many people, even if they're not an academic, can subscribe to that in this modern day where we're juggling so many different roles and responsibilities, and we like to think that we're very capable and able to do so much. And I think sometimes we've all, and I recognize myself in this, got to see where we have reached our limit a little bit and we're spreading ourselves too thin, and to prioritize what we have to do in the immediate here and now. And we are all the better for that. And I hold my hand up that during a very productive time in my career, my own health and well-being wasn't being prioritized. And I realized I have to walk the walk and talk the talk. I promote the importance of sport and physical activity in health and well-being. And a few years ago, I realized I wasn't prioritizing that for my own health and well-being, and therefore wasn't able to offer my students and the people I work with and my colleagues and people in prison as good a engagement as I could be. So yeah, that's one area where I've reflected and realized actually I do need to factor in time for health and well-being. Just this weekend just gone, I was at a yoga festival, for example, and in days gone by, I might have thought I'm too busy, I've got too much work to catch up on over the weekend or something like that. So I don't know if that's the kind of example that you were thinking of, but it's certainly something that has made me reflect a little bit.
But I think that's a really important one, because it's a false economy to think, if I work more hours, I'll get more done. And going to a different space again, and guess what happens? You can recharge and reboot in a quite wonderful way. So yeah, I'll take that one. That's an excellent piece of advice. Okay, so now it's time to ask our final big question. Now what? So here I'd like one practical tip, something if possible low cost but high impact that will improve services for young people.
See, finding it difficult to narrow this down to one. We've already talked a little bit about my dream of young people being able to access a kind of a sports fund or something, but it'll come as no surprise. I do think that we should be encouraging young people to practice risk-taking in a healthy sporting type of environment, and to integrate activities in ways that we wouldn't normally. So, for example, I've started doing walking interviews in prisons, a walking methodology where we walk side by side, and people can be very open and receptive to that approach. It breaks down some of those barriers that we might traditionally see. So what I'm getting at here is I think we should and could be a bit more creative about how we engage with young people that we work with, and that more often than not, they really welcome that, as long as it's co-designed with those young people. So I've just been doing a project with women and girls in prison who are recognised as being the least active population in our prison population. When I actually speak to women and girls, it's not that they don't want to be physically active, it's that they haven't been given the opportunities to do things that chime with them. They haven't really been consulted enough on what they want or what they need. So it may sound very obvious, but collaborating with the people that we work with to design the interventions or the programs or the initiatives that we want to offer them should always be the first step. And I think many of us sometimes assume we know from the literature and from our previous practice, and to factor in time to consult with and properly engage with those people that we are working with, so that they do have some ownership over and some really valuable contributions into what we're doing, is massively rewarding and very important.
I think that's wonderful. Using the consultative model with young people as a first step, and pardon the pun, I love the idea of the walking context, because you're on a journey, and if it's a difficult conversation, it's going to come to an end. It's not quite as intense. There's so much in that, and there is no cost involved in walking as compared to sitting, face to face. So I think with that inspirational advice, it's really wonderful. We've come to the end of our episode. But Rosie, I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your superb and really creative strategies that were going to help so many young people get back on track. I'm really grateful. So thank you.
You're very welcome. It's been lovely to chat to you.
Thank you.